Caplan came here in 1971 from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and very famously started Cape Breton's magazine and became publisher of Breton Books. We also have Johanna Padelt, who is homesteaded up in Cape North for, well, since she came in 1971 as well, and was the established a business of the jewelry at Cape North, and then also Arts North. So very involved in sort of the arts of that part of the island. And David Martin came in a little earlier in 1970 and worked as a potter, a cabinet maker, and still works as a carpenter. And I've known David for many, I think about 40 years, actually.
I think so.
Yeah, 40 years, and I'd say about a month, you know, just how old I am. And Andrew Terris came here with Rejene Stowe in 1971, where he homesteaded on 55 acres in northern Cape Breton. And they built their own house, they grew their own food, they cut their own firewood, and they also established a successful stained glass business. And you had a commune, you were part of a commune for a bit there as well.
3 years, yeah.
For quite a few years, yeah. So today, there's I guess a bunch of sort of bigger questions I want to get at in terms of the idea of the back to land movement being sort of an aesthetic kind of phenomenon, and what it means for the day-to-day lives of back to the landers being a kind of cultural and aesthetic practice, which I think it very much was. But I guess for the purpose of kind of introduction, is I want to hear everybody's kind of quick, story about how did you find your way to Cape Breton. So first, in about 30 seconds each. So I'm going to try and be strict here. I'm going to try and be strict, which I know will be hard and moderating. So please forgive me if I'm cutting people off, but we'll try and be speedy. So Ron, how did you come to Cape Breton?
I can do mine in 30 seconds. I knew nothing about Cape Breton Island at all, and I was just kind of lost in the world, didn't know what I was going to do. And a fella told me that Cape Breton Island was the place, the place on earth to go, and I was just ready to make a leap. And I did, and I got here, and he said, "It's not Cape Breton Island. He had another place in mind." And so, for all I know, he's still looking for something. But I decided not to follow him, and the rest is my history.
Great, Johanna.
In 1963, my then husband and I decided to take a vacation to a different place, and we saw it on the map. It was the furthest point east except for Newfoundland. Looked like a nice and remote and interesting, and that's how we first came to Cape Breton in 1963, and then eventually moved here in 1971.
Okay, great, thank you. David.
I used to tell people who asked me when I first was living in Port Hood, what got you to Cape Breton, and my quick answer was fate. But I first saw Cape Breton in '67, just traveling and touring, and really loved it, and moved to Nova Scotia in 1970, and just came to Cape Breton a couple years after that, and really liked it.
Great. And Andrew?
I was living in the Green Mountains in Vermont at the time, working in a bookstore, living in a house way up in the mountains with a bunch of hippies. And there was, in New England, there was this buzz about Cape Breton, that it was beautiful, remote, unspoiled, and that land was cheap. So we had a scouting expedition in 1969, 3 college friends and I came back with, I had subsequently met my partner, Rejene Stowe. We came up on a motorcycle in 1970, and then a bunch of us came back in 71, bought a piece of land in Red River, Inverness County, and lived there for 12 years.
Great. And I guess one thing came up in my correspondence with everybody was, well, people said, well, I'm not sure I was a back to the lander, or there's some dispute about the definition. Does anyone want to define try and define a back to the lander?
What's the question?
Can anybody define a back to the lander?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll speak to that just briefly in saying that my immediate response was that I probably didn't fit into it, and that my life had taken another kind of turn. And I had to be reminded by someone else that I really did make an attempt for a short while, and with a very bad back conditions. I tried to do that, but I actually did. I had gardens. I did for a short while raise pigs, chickens. So to a certain extent, I guess I do fit in a little bit. But I got, we'll say, diverted into publishing Cape Breton's magazine, and that became all-consuming after that. And so over the years, I'd forgotten back to the land while I watched the trees grow up and fill the fields.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
I would say that, for me, it was the essence of it was providing as much of what you needed to live, by your own resources as you possibly could. So as you said, we built the house, we cut the wood, we grew the vegetables, and we had a stained glass business to provide, cash income for that which we could not produce ourselves. So it was that idea of independence and self-sufficiency and self-reliance that was very much at the essence of it.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did that sort of differentiate you from other people in a rural community, being a back to the lander? In a sense, other people were doing this very similar things, it seemed. Like, what were the kind of markers of those differences?
Markers in terms of differences between us and
other people in rural communities.
Just mean the local people here.
Yeah, because it seems that other people were doing the same things as you were doing.
In some ways, but not totally.
I think that in our experience, a lot of the older people who were 30, 40 years older than us when we moved here had lived on the land. Their children were born at home in their houses, but the ideal for them was to be more living in towns, not dependent on the land, because very few, as North American farming got harder and harder to make a living, you couldn't make a living on the farm. And so they had given up. And we actually, one of the nice things about we lived on a farm for about 12 years when we started, and we had pigs and chickens, and we did kind of live off the land, but we couldn't make a living at it. You had to make money other ways. But the old people were really encouraging, because that had been something they had been through, and they loved to see people come and try to keep the land going rather than let it all get grown over.
Yeah, I had the same experience that when we first were looking around for land, and the neighbor that we then ended up with was taking us to different places. When we then said goodbye to him, he just said, don't go. Like he was so anxious to have people moving into there were all these abandoned farms. I mean, they were all over the place. Land was just, you could choose your farm.
Mm-hmm.
And so the people were extremely supportive, and my neighbor provided me, when I then ended up being there by myself, with firewood, with vegetables, and just being very supportive. And because they wanted to see this land, being kept up and reclaimed, and
we
lived
were
in.
all middle class, mostly university educated, urban, and we came into the situation knowing nothing but what we did have because we were educated. And this is where things like the Whole Earth Catalog came in. We knew how to access the resources, to find books and information that allowed us to learn how to do it. And then in concert with people who had, local knowledge of, the growing conditions and the local resources, we sort of managed to put all that together. But my favorite story comes from Parker Donham, who probably most of you know, who had a place on Bullardry Island in the 70s and was homesteading there. And he talked about how, there were all these, middle-class kids coming from the city and going to Cape Breton. Meanwhile, the young people from Cape Breton were leaving, and going elsewhere. And his image was like looking over your shoulder at the other guy going, what does he know that I don't know?
Well, I guess that takes me to my next question, which is why did you do this? Aside from Cape Breton is an amazing, beautiful, interesting place, but what were you leaving? What were you escaping?
I was leaving. It was interesting to hear Dave talk about teaching as a subversive activity. I was involved in teaching as a subversive activity before I moved to Cape Breton, and found that after a while, I realized that I was teaching things that I wasn't living myself. I felt I was not living an authentic life. And that is basically what brought me to Cape Breton, is to find a more authentic, a more simple, a more rooted, natural kind of lifestyle, away from all of the politics. I'm back into political action now, but really gave that up for many, many years. And getting away from all those consumerism and all that kind of stuff.
David.
Well, a lot of what Johanna says resonates for me. It was looking for a quality of life. I had, growing up, a lot of friends who had been involved with anthroposophy, with Rudolf Steiner, with Scott Nearing. I had a friend who made maple syrup with him. And there was actually a large movement in the States, and maybe in Canada, but in the States, like in the 30s, of people moving back to the land and people getting interested in organic food. And so I was friends with people who were involved with that, and that was one part of the calling. Another part was political. I was really proud of Canada's role in the world and not pleased with the U.S. role, which is where I had come from. And I didn't see that changing for the foreseeable future, so that was part of my drive to move to Canada. And then once I was here, Cape Breton became a really good choice. And it was a quality of life and elbow room, living rurally as opposed to in a city. So there was that pull for me to be in a rural area.
Yeah, I think a lot of people forget that Canada was really known as a peacemaking country, and it had that role in the world, and the feel of the United States at that time was just painful to wake up to every day. It's hard for me to take myself back there. I don't have that great a memory, and maybe have chosen to not remember it well. But those were painful times, and I really needed to take a leap. And then I fell among the people, I don't mean others like myself, the local people who were just so good, so inviting, so welcoming, and really very, they may have been critical in their kitchens. They had to be. They had to say, say, who wears their hair like that? And what chance does his children have? And is he feeding them properly? Whatever it might be. But never to your face. If you said you were going to dump coal on your garden, they'd let you. But if you asked them, should I dump coal on my garden? They'd give you a fair answer, and they'd probably come and help you get the coal back off of your garden. So I was very grateful. I mean, I landed, right between people of the 50s, we'll say, and people of the 20s and the 30s on the two sides. And one was a subsistence farm. They used their pensions by chewing tobacco and sugar and things like that, and they did their best to have a milk, have a cow, have a horse, raise a hay, and just live a simple life, and fish. And I was just very fortunate to have fallen among them, and then it just spread from them to the next further neighbors, and of course my life finally became all of Cape Breton with Cape Breton's magazine.
I want to ask about some of the ideals of that time. And
can I answer that question?
Yeah.
Because what I thought about was more in terms of we all came from the States, and in the 60s, those were really tumultuous times, and I mean. We all lived through that. I mean, in the early 60s, the threat of nuclear war was real. The Cuban Missile Crisis scared the shit out of everybody. We thought that was game over. There was the Civil Rights Movement, there was the Peace Movement, there was the Cold War, there was some pretty regressive politics, coming out of the McCarthy era. Vietnam War, and '68 I think was a really pivotal year because It was the assassination of RFK, Martin Luther King, riots in the streets, anti-war demonstrations. I mean, it just went on. And I think, like personally, I was very much involved in the peace movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. And at a certain point, I think there was terminal burnout. People had just been so active for so long, and we didn't see change. And I think people were just looking for an alternative where you had more control over your own life. So rather than being put upon by this toxic socio-political cultural system, you know, I think what we wanted to get away from it, and we wanted to create a real alternative to that milieu. Mm-hmm. And I think that was sort of the backstory to what motivated.
Yeah, very well said. Yeah.
And so there's an alternative which was manifest in Cape Breton, but there must have been sort of conduits of information.
Oh, yeah.
They weren't just interpersonal in terms of people telling you there's this place and you can go there and it's really extraordinary. But there must have been things that you read. There must have been books and philosophies and ideas. Like, what were those key ideas that shaped that vision for everyone? I'm not sure who I want
We all read Scott Neary.
Yeah, we did.
We all read Living the Good Life. The Whole Earth catalog was a kind of Bible.
Yeah.
No question about that. I guess I personally was tied in an odd way. I published a poetry magazine called Mother, and it was just a mimeograph magazine. But you very quickly found out that there were hundreds of these magazines across the country, and you became part of someone to talk to about those subjects. And I think the Whole Earth catalog was sort of a kind of Bible at that point. That and Organic Gardening magazine.
Yeah.
You looked at it whether you had a garden or not. And I think that those things tied us in with but for me, I had this extra little group. I used to, I don't know how, I used to travel back, I was a poet groupie. I was really interested in I would go to places where there was small magazines in New Mexico and San Francisco, places like that, and there'd be groups of people. And but they'd also be part often of communes, and then those communes had these ideals. And I suppose that's how I came to see some of that and think about it.
Went to a wonderful workshop with Buckminster Fuller in London, Ontario in '68 for 2.5 days listening to him, and he could start a paragraph and he'd go off a tangent for about 15-20 minutes and come back exactly to where he was, and just this amazing mind, but a really interesting image of how to manage the world and how to live one's life in a different way. That was, and I can't say I followed his advice, but it's just this kind of thinking, and there were quite a few people around. The talk was indicating that, really stretched people's imaginations. It was a very exciting time between music and art and the philosophy around, and people being upset with the old ways, and the younger generation, the so-called hippies or whatever, really trying to shake the tree and trying to create something new. Mm-hmm. And some of it has lasted and some of it didn't, kind of got enveloped back into the mainstream, but it was a concerted effort by a lot of us, I could say, to really try to make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting for me, I was also shaped by all of the things we've been talking about this whole time. I didn't expect to find them in Cape Breton. When we moved here, I thought we were going to be the only ones from the outside world, and that it would be just living in Cape Breton with Cape Bretoners and so forth. And it was really interesting to find out that, in fact, down north where I was living, Cape North area, that whole northern area, this is from our food. We were all ordering from a food co-op, and we had the largest group in the Cape North area, which is amazing. And so when we got there in 1971, all of a sudden met all these other people that were just, had places in the hills. And that was a total surprise. So I don't know how the rest of you were, but for us it was like, okay, we want to do something different. We want to be, not part of anymore of where we were. And we were choosing actually to go somewhere where we wouldn't have anybody that shared those ideas. That was our image.
So there wasn't a sense of being part of a larger counterculture at the time?
Not here.
Not here.
Well, or not in the en route here.
But
And I think, in terms of the Back to the Land movement, I'm not sure. I don't think any of us thought we were part of a movement at the time.
Not in a formal sense.
No.
at all.
Yeah, I had the good fortune of working in a bookstore in Vermont, as I mentioned, and so I co-managed it with another guy. So we had we could order any books we wanted. So we cottoned on to the Whole Earth catalog very early on and started ordering. We sold records, so we had all the coolest, grooviest, 60s music. We had all kinds of radical books, including this one, which we mentioned, Living the Good Life by Helen and Scott Nearing. And this was my Bible. I read this, sitting, looking out over the misty green mountains, and as a city boy, it just opened this whole new world to me of possibility of a more real, genuine, authentic lifestyle as an alternative to what was going on in the cities. They were a couple who they were sort of leftist, communist, anarchists in the I think he
In the
went,
20s, he
well,
started.
didn't he? I think he went to jail during the First World War because
Right.
he was a draft. Refused to draft.
He was fired from being a teacher for his
Columbia.
political.
So they went
views
back
and-
to the land in Vermont in the 30s
Mhm.
during the Depression. They moved out of the city and they successfully homesteaded all their lives. And when Vermont got too crowded, they moved to Maine and they wrote a book about it. And it's very intelligent, it's very readable, it's very practical.
Except
and
for the
and
stone, except for the stones. Except for the stone. He built with stone.
Yeah.
And that was, that was, even when by the time I got to Cape Breton, it was still, because they had plenty of stone in Cape Breton.
Yeah.
And a friend wrote to me and said, have you ever lifted a stone?
Yeah, you just had a bad back. That was your problem.
On top of it. There you go. So, except for the stone, and a tremendous amount of work Scott Nearing would do, just to be free.
But they set it up so that I just started rereading it for the first time since I read it in 1969 in Vermont, and their goal was to spend half their time what they called bread labor, doing the stuff that they needed to do to survive, and so that they could spend the other half of their time, reading, writing, socializing, making music, and they succeeded. And that was kind of our goal, to have. You don't want to just be,
Drudge.
a drudge. You want to have a life, and that was their solution for living the good life. The book is still in print. Highly recommend it.
One thing that's interesting here, though, is a sense of not knowing other people are doing that, and being surprised at finding other people out here. But there must have been a sense of being part of a counterculture before you left, that there was some sort of collective activity or collective consciousness around these sorts of social political problems that we've been describing.
Well, I didn't expect to see it in Nova Scotia so much. Like, I knew it was happening in New Mexico and Colorado.
Or California.
So when I moved to Canada, it wasn't for that. It was to live in the way we've been talking. And it was a, wonderful surprise when I moved to Port Hood and there was all these interesting individuals in the woods. And
I went to Woodstock, and there were 500,000 of us, and we knew we were different from the rest of mainstream American society. There was definitely a sense of something other that was happening.
But did you expect that to be here?
No, not really.
Yeah.
I mean, but we'll talk about the whole idea of whether it was a movement or not. But we can-
Well, did that sense of other, was that different than the counterculture that you left in Vermont or in New York or in Pennsylvania? Was there a particular quality to the counterculture that you found here in Cape Breton eventually? Because
More
it- you all-
grounded, much more grounded.
much more grounded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, definitely.
And you say grounded, like, can you elaborate a bit, like?
Grounded in the sense that as things shook out, the people who were able to stay, or even the ones who were there, basically had more of a sense of reality, a sense of responsibility, that they were here, they had to exist here, make a living somehow. They weren't just kind of drifting. It was more like once you've made the step to come to Nova Scotia or somewhere in the North Country from somewhere in the sunny south of the States, you've made a commitment to a change of lifestyle, and it became grounded because you were actually rooted to the land. You actually tried to make things work on that level.
It was serious. It wasn't just drug, sex, rock and roll.
Yeah.
And I mean,
Unfortunately.
Though there was some of that as well.
Well, he said not just.
Johanna used to throw some really incredible parties. She was an instigator.
Yeah.
She could dance. She probably still can dance.
She can still dance.
She can still dance. It's dynamite. It's dynamite.
Well, I feel like all of you here. Let me ask you a question now.
Give her a kitchen and you know, and the Eagles.
I was losing my microphone. Well, I think all of you have arts degrees of some kind. I feel like, no? But
Sorry,
I have arts degrees. I've studied as artists and some are trained.
I did somewhat, yeah.
Did. And Ron, you studied, I presume, literature or poetry at some point.
Well, yeah. So I studied. I thought I was an English major, and then in the end, I took a degree as in education.
Okay.
My
I was
degree is
fit
in
to
education.
teach.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I did equivalent of a Master's of Fine Art. But
and I have a degree in biology.
Interesting. Well, I'm interested. I guess maybe the question for David is how did that training influence your experience here in Cape Breton? Not just in terms of what you did, but the ideals that you've brought with you here.
Well, when I went to Alfred to study pottery, I did not have a BA, so I went as a special student. And when I got there, they allowed me to take the MFA course, which I took the whole MFA course and passed the final tests, but I wouldn't get the piece of paper. I was a non-matriculated student. And so the reason I was learning the pottery was to make a living at it as a way of making a living. I had worked at carpentry for 7 years before I studied pottery, and so when I moved to Nova Scotia, I set up a pottery, and I was doing that for about 5 years, and not making any real money. We were surviving, but I didn't really have any money in my background, didn't really have enough capital, as it were, to ever really get going on a good business footing. And one winter, somebody realized I had been a carpenter and asked me to work on a motel, and someone else asked me to do another job, and someone asked me to do a set of cabinets, and I went back to that trade, and it was a lot easier for me to make a living. Mm-hmm. So in terms of answering your question, the purpose of the pottery was, for my personal self I loved doing things with my hands, I loved crafts, and it gave me an in coming here. It started me off. I met wonderful people through it, but it wasn't really essential to living here. It was a way of living.
But it seems that most of you at some point have used the arts as a way to make a living here, even if you may not have been trained in that way. And so it's a kind of economic function where you produce objects that are then sold. But there's also, I think, I want to put the idea of art as being something that's your day-to-day lives, the kinds of conscious decisions you make. It's the culture that you've created and perhaps you identify around yourself. And so perhaps I want to draw attention, think about those kinds of conscious activities, and maybe come to Ron with your work with Cape Breton's magazine, because these are oral histories which are it's the language of as it's spoken. You're not writing articles about these people. They're speaking in their own voice, which is quite an interesting thing. And that's a really kind of poetic. It's a really conscious decision to do. It's not like Canadian Geographic or the Chronicle Herald. You're not quoting people. You're giving them 10 pages, and they're telling their stories the way they wanted to tell them.
That happened over a period of time. You might as well just say it straight out. If you take Cape Breton's magazine and hold it up to the Whole Earth catalog, you'll see that they're the same size. That the Whole Earth catalog, like Cape Breton's magazine, has a heavier cover, but for economics it used newsprint. There's a certain way of folding paper that, for economics, comes out to be the size of the Whole Earth catalog, also comes out to be Cape Breton's magazine. And then if you go to the first issues of the magazine for a while, you'll see that it's how to make an axe handle, how to make snowshoes, how to garden. It's trails out of Meat Cove. And also there's people talking, there's no question about that. It was really kind of a back to the lander, and more and more I realized how much the Whole Earth catalog and all I was reading as a result of the Whole Earth catalog was affecting the choices there. What I was missing, of course, and it was other people like George Herman, for instance, who stopped me and he said, listen, he said, you're going to run out of how-to articles, but you've got other things to talk about, how people live. George Herman stopped me like that. And another fellow, David Frank, took me into a bar in Dominion and sat me down and he said, listen, he said, you're missing all of industrial Cape Breton with the whole other part of Cape Breton life. And out of that became these interviews, they became longer and longer and became the dominant element of the magazine. And you're right, I never did give up poetry. you just listen to those people speaking and telling us their stories in a straightforward way. And paragraph by paragraph, I think I never did give up my devotion to poetry.
I have a little story to tell about how this all got started. I can remember it was probably about 1972, and Ron and his then wife came to visit us in Cape North, and we were, resurrecting this old farmhouse that basically the roof was going, the foundation had gone, and if we hadn't come along at that time, it would have just rotted into the ground. Anyway, we've gotten it back to reasonable. We'd scraped the 5 layers of wallpaper off and so forth, and Ron and Michelle came and on a little inspection tour. And see, there was a talk about aesthetic. Like, there were aesthetics that were tied to the Back to the Land movement, and one of them was you were not allowed to paint anything. And so when we announced that after doing all of this work of scraping the walls and getting it to their pristine bare woodness, that we were going to paint them white. Well, that was against, we were not allowed to do this. Michelle said no, and yes, it wasn't Ron. Michelle said no, and there's, your kids, we didn't have any kids. We actually never did have any kids, and they would eat the lead paint, etc. But anyway, in that little tour, what I remember most vividly, aside from that, is that Ron started talking about his idea for a magazine. And this is so interesting. It's so interesting how all these, our lives evolved here. We all came here with some idea, but not what we ended up actually doing here. And so Ron was talking to us about this magazine, idea of this magazine, and he was going to make a living with this magazine. And I remember after they left, we said, oh, God, that is a really, wow. I'm going to make a living with this kind of magazine, and yes.
Well, I lived.
And we painted the walls, and nobody died.
No, it's lovely.
There is one aspect to your question in terms of living your art, And I think for a certain number of people, there was a conscious image of one can live their art as opposed to just making art, but that you create a quality of life that becomes an art. And I think that is a philosophic idea, probably Japanese in various countries. But I think some of us thought along those lines at times.
And was that a very conscious decision to live consciously and translate your ideals into a lived practice?
One tries.
One tries, yeah.
It's like trying to do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, how did that translation work for David or for Andrew? I don't know who wants to go first.
You mean the work as an aesthetic practice?
Well, yeah, just your
Or
life.
your life
life
is an
is.
aesthetic
My
practice.
life is an aesthetic practice. I don't know, I think I failed on that one.
Disaster.
I know.
Disaster.
I don't know, I'm not sure I can answer that. It's not something I ever
think we're on our
really,
way.
I mean, like Johanna said, I mean, there was definitely an aesthetic that, certain, like the bare wood, earth tones, natural fibers, and all of that. And, if you look at the pictures, you see a certain similarity in the aesthetic of people's houses. But it was, there was never an ideology or, it gets back to the whole idea of whether this was a movement, because, it really, it was a movement in the sense of people all moving in a similar direction at the same time. But there was no overarching, there were no leaders, there were no organizations, there was no ideology. I mean, something like the Whole Earth Catalog was about as close as it came to as sort of or living the good life as a common touchstone. But within that, we were all, moving independently, individually, and so I guess there was maybe an implicit ideology and an implicit aesthetic, but it wasn't. I don't think of it as being particularly articulated at the time. It was more sort of intuitive, organic, and we lived it. And there were definitely similarities. There's a picture over there of a George Thomas, the photographer, and his wife Lynn every year used to have an auction on the summer solstice. They had a summer solstice gathering, and all the hippies and back to the landers, we'd all come out of the woods, and bring our cast-offs, and Ann's husband Gary he would be the auctioneer, and we'd all just hang out together and party and eat potluck and have a good time. But there was definitely an implicit shared aesthetic ideology, and you knew it, you sensed it, even if you couldn't necessarily articulate it at the time.
David, you want to?
Well, that's,
Oh, okay, great.
yeah.
Well, maybe the best thing, we're getting to about 45 minutes, and I want to have time for some dialogue between the panelists or other questions to emerge, and also with the audience. So let's at this point open this up. So,
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, let's see. Actually, first, Conrad.
Yeah, you brushed over it, but I think for a great source of humor, you said it wasn't all sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
There you go.
Well, for a period it was, before. And that was interesting to me is the transition between the hippie who lives for the moment and just gets high, and then the development of the philosophy, let's get serious, we're having kids, what to do. But it wasn't very easy necessarily to go from, like when all your friends would come from the city and all they wanted to do was party and you had to work and so on. Can somebody talk about it? I don't know, looking back is a great source of humorous anecdotes, that transition between party hippie and farmer.
Well, I think
City hippie and country hippie.
when I was living in Vermont, before I came to Cape Breton, I think that was the sex, drugs, rock and roll phase, and got tired of that very quickly, and wanted something more serious and more substantive, and that's when I read the Nearing's book, and that's when I really started to get serious. And one of the things that kind of struck me, and anyone can shoot me down over this, but I think there was sort of there was a Western hippie movement and an Eastern hippie movement, and those of us who came out of the East, I think there was more of a idealistic sense of some kind of, not necessarily a mission, but wanting to take this in a serious direction. And because you had the tradition of, the whole New England tradition of people like Thoreau, Emerson, the Nearings. There was a place called the School for Living, which influenced the Nearings during the Depression in upstate New York. So there was this, there was really a serious underpinning to a lot of this that I'm not sure was quite so prevalent out west. I definitely sensed it in terms of what was going on in the east.
Mm-hmm. Sounds fair.
Oh, yes. Yeah, Nicole.
Hi, I'll stand up. My name's Nicole.
Ooh, Walden T-shirt.
I know.
Right
I feel that the back to land movement obviously was big in the 70s, and then it kind of died away, right? People sort of, I don't know if all kids of back to the landers became back to the landers themselves. My sense is some of them had that sort of aesthetic, but didn't really. But the movement seems to be gaining speed again. There was a great podcast, Story and Ideas episode on CBC about the degrowth movement and people sort of getting rid of it. And there's this reaction now that's very similar to the philosophies behind the original Back to the Land movement. I was wondering, do you think that this movement, the homestead movement, ebbs and flows, or do you think it's starting to flow and maybe will permanently flow now?
Well, there's a young man over there that did a thrashing machine. That's kind of a continuation of a generation. But my experience around Fort Hood has been that it's never, it seemed like a large movement in the 70s, like you say, but it seems like there's always been a constant trickle of people coming in and leaving. And some stay who trickle in, and some of the originals leave, and it has never seemed that it's died out. In a sense, it's just hasn't been a movement, maybe as it was in the 60s and 70s, but it's been a steady stream. And there's quite a few young people now coming around who are interested in making livings on farms in some way, and there's still that energy. I don't know if it's going to be permanent.
Don't you think we came out of kind of a time of abundance,
Yeah.
and those were many political concerns were making us dissatisfied with life. Whereas that sense of abundance and what a young person is going to do with his life today, it seems to me it's a much tougher world than we were. We really had that alternative: come here, give it a try. If it doesn't work, well, we can fall back on our degree, or I could always substitute teach, or whatever the question is. Today, I think we're going to see this happen, but I think we're going to see it motivated much more by the fact that governments have failed us completely, and so has industry, and so has business, and it's going to be up to young people to make a better kind of life, and probably do it cooperatively. Which we're talking here about. So many of us, we discovered we got here, and then there were others dressed like we were and with similar interests and reading the same books. But I think they're going to come in organized groups. They're going to have realized they're going to probably be in the cities and realize there's just no hope for them to all have a good life out of it. But maybe all these empty farms in places like Cape Breton Island can be rejuvenated, and maybe that's just one hopeful thought I have. It's just to say that it's not the same world that we came here.
I think it's a response to crisis. I mean, the Nearings left New York during the Depression. We left the States during the Vietnam War and all of the stuff that was going on.
Well, we could have stayed there and put our bodies on the line, and some of us did for a period of time. But see, I came here. I was 30 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wasn't in 19. Around that. But they're suffering now at 19, and they're looking for what are they going to do with their lives.
I'm trying to reinforce your point in saying that I think there is a growing crisis, and I know young people who are seriously thinking about who want to go back to the land. So I think
the other part of my point, you said earlier, we were all kind of middle class, and many of us were. Although a lot of the Canadians who came to Cape Breton You wouldn't say they were middle class.
Really?
A lot of working class kids came here and made lives, and they're still here.
Okay.
And there's no question about that. So I don't think these kids are getting a chance to become middle class today.
Yeah.
They're not even getting that opportunity that we all really enjoy. They're going to have to do it really on the sweat of their brow.
Yeah.
And on their clever
But they're educated.
cooperation.
They're educated now. I think that's a big difference.
Educated in different ways, yeah, and not just the classroom. That's true. And they also have all this, whatever we had to go to as far as Whole Earth catalog, those books are still there. The beautiful thing about books, whether they're electronic or they're on paper,
Yeah.
is they're still there.
Yeah.
And just some guidance.
Oh, actually, I think Janet.
I grew up in Sydney River in the 60s and 70s, and every morning when I went to school, I saw a plume over the pier and the steel plant. And I'm just wondering, because you're going back to a kind of healthy way of living, what did you think about industrial Cape Breton and about the steel plant? That's one question. And how do you think that Back to the Landers affected the Cape Bretoners that had been living on that side of the island as long as they did?
You looking at me?
Anybody?
Well, that's a long evening and a bottle of wine.
All right. You buying?
That's absolutely.
What did you think about the steel plant and the way that industrial Cape Breton, the coal mines, because there were a lot of immigrants before the 60s.
Industrial Cape Breton was a surprise to me. I came right into the North Shore area and the Tarbert Valley, Victoria County, and then that was a surprise. But I'm from Pittsburgh. Well, Pittsburgh cleaned and then lost all of its steel.
Port Hood and had the coal mines, and Inverness and Mabu all had coal mines. So there was a tradition of that kind of industrialization on the west side of Cape Breton, as well as Inverness County was also the breadbasket of Cape Breton in terms of agricultural produce. So it's kind of a mixture of the two. And I think Inverness was really the hardest hit when the mines went down, and it became, it really stretched them sociologically more so than Mabu and Port Hood, but it's on the rebound now. And in terms of the other part of your question of what the Cape Bretoners thought of us, how we affected.
How you may have changed their thinking about culture, life, whatever.
Well, in Inverness County, I can say after World War II, the large number of Dutch came over and set up farms. And so I think it kind of woke people up in some sense that these same pieces of land, which the local people had given up as not being able to make a living, here people were coming with a new image and making a living. And so there's a little bit of that feeling, I think, when we came, and like I've said, and Johanna talked about how people really encouraged us to use the land. I think people were very open to the new ideas, and almost all the come from a ways I know of have been on various co-op boards and boards in the community, been really well treated and well respected in a way. So it's been a good...
Not to put words in your mouth, but I think the question you seem to be asking is if we had come to Cape Breton and landed in industrial Cape Breton, would we have stayed?
No, I'm actually thinking, because for me, seeing that cloud over the pier every morning was akin to a mushroom cloud. And we grew up knowing how toxic it was.
That's correct.
And my mother, in fact, grew up in the pier, and all of her siblings had cancer. So, that was just it.
You remember the saying that probably your mother probably told you that in those days there was no smoke, no baloney.
That's right. Yeah.
And
I just remember coming into Sydney, because from way up in the northern tip of the island, our first shopping point was Shetty Camp, and the next one, if there was stuff we couldn't get in Shetty Camp, we came to Sydney. So we came into Sydney very occasionally. And what struck me about Sydney was how incredibly friendly the people were. I will never forget going into I forget, some maybe automotive parts store or somewhere looking for some specific item, and the guy didn't have it, so he sent me to his competitor. That would never happen in the United States of America. And I was so moved by that. And as far as the pollution, I remember driving into Whitney Pier at night. And there were these, you know, street lights, and there was just this pall of smoke in the air. And I just remember, and you could, you know, you breathe and you could feel it. And I just remember being absolutely shocked. So when I found out years later that Whitney Pier had some of the highest cancer rates in Canada, I was not surprised. As far as, you know, our influence, I remember in Pleasant Bay when we moved there, nobody was gardening. It's like, was it you that was saying about how everybody wanted to move into town and, you know, buy at the supermarket? So we were the only people in town who were gardening, but after we started gardening, a lot of other people went, oh yeah, we can do that. I mean, they used to garden, of course, because they had to, but, you know, they kind of took it up again. And I could tell you stories about drug use, but that's another story.
Would you have moved to industrial Cape Breton?
If I had landed in industrial Cape Breton,
No, would you have moved there?
Would you have?
would I have moved?
To industrial Cape Breton?
No, that was-
Probably not, no. But I'm not sure exactly what the reason for that would have been.
Because you just said that, and I just thought I'd ask you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair question, but I would like to think more about why the reason for that would be. I wanted something quite different, and something much more romantic, and something less. Definitely, I love Pittsburgh. I have to say that, but I wanted it to be a lot different than what I'd come from, and I guess I did. There's, you know, I listened to Country Roads on the radio all the way to Cape Breton. Take me home, Country Roads.
Country roads.
That was West Virginia.
I know it was West Virginia, but it, you know.
It was a sentiment.
The sentiment and the look of the place. No, once I saw St. Anne's Bay, and that really, well, you know, those are the things that helped with me. That's why I didn't follow the fellow who was quite a powerful, in many ways, powerful attraction for a fellow who really didn't have his feet on the ground.
Let's
It
take
took a lot of
two more
Cape Breton
questions.
to, you know, it was the strength of Cape Breton that gave me the courage to stay.
I saw a hand up somewhere back here. I'm not sure they're still here. Okay, then yes, first, and then Claire. Yeah.
In reference to those Cape Bretoners who worked the land prior to your arrival, that generation prior to, would it be fair to say that they were of the land and you all became of the land over time in an evolutionary sense because you didn't necessarily want to fit into something that you thought existed at the time, which probably didn't exist? You all contributed and it became something several years later. Would that be fair to say that? That they were of the land and you all became of the land over time?
For a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't say that I ever became of the land in the sense you're talking about, like working the land and...
No, the back to the land situation, you didn't strive to become a back to the lander, but you did become part of that land in terms of being attached to the soil.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, so much so that I'm no longer living on that piece of land, and it was like pulling up like the roots of a huge tree to leave there.
Yeah.
Very much so.
I still have my property. We moved to Halifax. We lived there from 71 to 82. We moved to Halifax, but still have the land, the house, and you know, it's like a refuge, a retreat. I mean, I know it, you know, almost better than anything else, and it's part of me, no question.
And I still have my shop on my original land, so.
Claire.
My question is, if you had a back to the lander of 1920, today everything would be on social media. So the aesthetic would be there, like the self-reflection of that generation, and all of us in many ways is captured by the internet. You didn't have that, right?
No.
And this is kind of for you. This question is sort of not a question because it's obvious, but for the others, how did you record what was going on, or did you? I mean, perhaps you did it in your land, perhaps you did it through your art, perhaps you told stories, perhaps you wrote journals or letters. How did you understand that experience beyond actually just living it as a piece of art?
Everything you said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything you said.
And are there places where that's kept so that we can see that?
I have letters, you know, photographs of art, yeah, but it's
Letters,
not publicly
journals.
available.
No.
No, I'm just curious, right? Because
Yeah.
now it's so public.
Yeah.
And at that point, it would have been quite private,
Yeah.
right? And in
Yeah.
a way
Yeah.
that speaks to the differences in which, you know, how we live our lives.
Which is
Yeah.
kind of what Amish did with this show, is bringing
Bringing it
a
together.
taste of what it was like with the photographs, George's photographs. It
And of
gives
course,
a taste of it.
With the magazine, that's
Yeah.
one place where it is, right? With your magazine.
Well,
That's the space.
that's all I have as a record of my life,
Yeah.
if that's what you mean,
I
yes.
wanted just to put in a plug for the CBC. We were talking about this on the way down.
Yeah.
We were all connected by Peter Zosky,
Good for
As
you.
it happens.
you know,
Yeah.
all those,
Yeah,
and
that's right.
really, especially as being, you know, craftspeople and artists, you know, stuck in our studios or workshops, whatever, and that was, you know, the CBC was on all day, and in those days,
Yeah.
as we all know, it was a lot better.
Yeah.
And there weren't repeat programs. And really, it was, I mean, speaking for myself, I was alone in my studio, you know, for hours, days, weeks, months. I mean, just, and it's a very lonely life until you get out and
And growing up in
see
Canada,
people. And so
I mean,
having that was amazing.
And it really unified your feeling for the country,
And you
for the
heard
whole
of-
country.
Yeah, I heard about other artists doing the same thing, and you know, you were all of, you know, Canada was brought into our
Yeah,
homes.
growing up in the USA, we knew nothing about Canada, and I remember, you know, exactly as Johanna said, you know, you were in your studio working and you were listening to the CBC, and there was great programming. And I remember after several years, they had on CBC, they had a questionnaire about Canadian history, and I listened to it and I answered all the questions correctly. I knew a lot about Canadian history and Canadian art and culture, et cetera, entirely because of the CBC. It was such an incredibly important.
And the local ones too, information board.
Oh, yeah,
Main
absolutely.
Street.
Except on our side of the island,
Except on your side of the.
No, you
we
had-
got Montreal, not Sydney.
Let's take one additional question, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to me that you folks as successful hippies, okay, what you did was
Back to the land.
Successful, that's the title for
Wow.
it. The last book in the whole Earth catalog.
A successful hippie.
What you seem to have done was to have built upon the skills of the classic Cape Breton farmer that couldn't make it, okay, by having a successful on-farm business, so you're able to finance your habit. Okay? Now, so that makes sense, because a lot of the small firms now are financed by outside jobs, just as
Yeah.
you people seem to have been the leaders in implementing. Okay, so anyway, when you did it, that was then, this is now. Okay, and there was certain kinds of turmoil then, and there's a different kind of turmoil now. Okay, and I guess what I'm getting at is that what's the future of Back to the Land at this point in time, and how many people are interested in doing it, and what's the best way for them to proceed?
Well, I have one aspect to that question. I'm on a food security committee in Inverness County, which Inverness County has set this up. It's amazing. But one of the things we've talked about in the last few meetings is trying to make a correlation between the available farm space in Inverness County and possible young people, maybe from the Netherlands, maybe from other parts of Canada, people who are interested in farming, and trying to set up a mechanism where people could actually come and work on the land. And we're trying as a food security committee to make it possible for the government of Inverness County, or actually it's going to be a pan-Cape Breton because all the municipalities in Cape Breton have signed on to this, to actually make it possible for people who want farm produce, like restaurants, to be hooked to people who can produce it, and to make it so that people who want the produce will make orders in advance so that this can be done, and set up, food processing plants, whatever, so that there can be a year-round supply of food. So in terms of your question, this is something in undertaking Inverness County is trying to do because of the road situation and the fact that the supply lines won't come to Nova Scotia, won't come to Cape Breton, if the troubles happen. So this is, we used to be self-sufficient in 1850, 1900. Cape Breton, grew 90% of their own food, exported food. Now it's 5% is what we grow.
Could I ask a
That's
question
great, that's very
regarding,
possible.
I'd like to ask a question regarding the recent development in the news about genetically modified foods, Monsanto,
Yeah.
and how there's a growing group of people who are looking to buy organic food.
Mm-hmm.
Would this not be an area that Cape Breton could expand upon to develop their agriculture in terms of Cape Breton lamb and beef? And I'm told that in Japan, when you buy beef, there's about 7 different kinds of grades of beef. And that would be wise to go into maybe a movement towards organic farming on Cape Breton Island, and it would, I guess, it'd be better quality food, but also would also be value-added food.
The biggest thing we're facing with the Agricultural Committee is really how do you get from point A to point B? The land is here, all the possibilities are here. A lot of it will have to be really education. It might take a generation. And some of the schools are starting to have school gardens, like Guysborough County has an amazing school garden where every year the kids have grown the garden, they have a community eating from the garden. It takes this kind of education to get people in Sydney, say, prefer to buy local, even though they have to pay 30-40% more. It costs more. People are paying artificially low prices on food because it's being grown artificially in places where they don't pay much wages. So yes, to your question, but it's going to take time to transition, and that's part of what we're trying to do is how you make the transition, and it's really complicated. But a lot is education.
When we were back to the Landers, the whole idea of organic food was definitely outside the mainstream, and it has become much more, in the mainstream, much more, people know a lot more about it, and people are buying, and that's really what it takes. So, that really ties into your question in terms of, the whole local source movement is, it's really growing very rapidly. It's very apparent in Halifax now, a lot of the restaurants, there are local source markets, farmers markets. It's really, but they're going to need the people in the rural areas who are producing, good organic produce, meat, et cetera, et cetera.
And you have to have the year-round supply, so you have to have the facilities to freeze food, to can food, to store cold storage. It all has to be built up together, and that's what's hard to do. It's like you have the idea, but to actually make it happen economically so people on the farm have the orders that they can actually grow the food, they have a way to preserve the food, and a way to sell it year-round. And there's the potential here to do it. Just has to.
We're actually just out of time, so I want to take this moment to wrap up. And I say thank you to our panelists and also to our audience. So a round of applause for